I guess you can have that big orange peanut.
Circus peanuts? I love those.
Yeah. Oh, they're the worst.
Oh,
Man,
so good.
You have the worst taste in candy I've ever heard.
So. Well, hello, everyone, and welcome to the Bible Geeks Weekly Podcast. This is episode 111. I'm Brian Sheely.
I'm Ryan Joy.
And thanks so much, everyone, for tuning in. We are in week 23 of our cross-training series. This week, we're continuing our conversation about reverence with a discussion about worship. And last week, we skipped our episode on fearing the Lord. And so if you missed that daily download, go check it out.
I think fearing the Lord gets a bad rap.
Oh, yeah.
People think that it's all about cringing before the wrath of God, but it's really about a recognition of who he is and who we are in relation to him that puts God at the place where he belongs and allows us to actually live without fear of anything else and to live in honor of him, recognizing that he's the only one that really is worthy of our fear.
And speaking of being worthy, I mean, God is clearly worthy of our worship. And so that's what we're going to talk about here on this episode. And it got me thinking about Apple's latest announcement. I don't know, have you heard about spatial audio?
No. I must have missed that keynote.
Yeah, so they didn't invent this idea, but it's basically like surround sound, but for music. This week, they actually started dropping some of their new tracks that they've put out, encoded basically in this surround sound format. And I was listening to one of my favorite songs, Huey Lewis and the News, The Heart of Rock and Roll.
You got the thump of the heartbeat.
Oh, it was great. Absolutely. And so there I am. I've got my headphones on, and it sounds like Huey is literally singing in my face. And there's a guitar on my left, and there's a bass on my right, and the backup singer is literally standing behind me. Like, it feels like you're standing on the stage. And it kind of got me thinking about how, like, the normal way you listen to music in stereo even, it feels one-dimensional after you've experienced something like this. It's almost like the transition from black and white to color, and like the transition from standard definition to high definition. This is like a high-definition version of music. It just kind of got me thinking, like, do I experience the richness that is the standing in the middle kind of worship, or am I settling for like a one-dimensional experience?
Oh, yeah, that's a great question. It's not about reaching for something like we have to make worship into this frenzy of emotion, but it's about recognizing who God is. And if we truly bring ourselves to the foot of the cross in the Lord's Supper, if we truly bring ourselves into an awareness of who we're approaching in prayer, we won't have a one-dimensional experience because we have a vast, rich, grand God that is worthy of worship, as you were alluding to.
All right, so let's get into our first segment here, and that's Like the Teacher. And so we're going to a story here where Jesus shows us about worship, and that is in John 4, verses 20 to 24. And we've come to this section a few times here in this cross-training series, but this is a conversation that Jesus has between him and the Samaritan woman at the well. And one of the first questions that she has for Jesus is about where they worship. Our fathers worshiped on this mountain, but you say that in Jerusalem is the place where people ought to worship. So she poses this question to Jesus, and Jesus doesn't really answer the question. He doesn't pick out one mountain or another, one place or another where they should worship. Basically, he blows it all up and says, you are going to worship wherever, really is kind of the answer that he gives. For the hour is coming, and now is here, when the true worshipers will worship the Father in spirit and truth, for the Father is seeking such people to worship him. And so, as Jesus gives her this answer about where they're going to worship, what do you find here about worship that teaches you something in your own life?
Well, there's a lot of emphasis on true worshipers, worshiping in truth. And it made me think about the different kinds of questions you have at school, like true or false.
Ooh.
In school, the hardest questions were essay questions because you had to really think about your answers. The ones we liked best were true and false. You didn't have to think too hard. You have a 50-50 chance, even if you know nothing about it.
Flip a coin.
And I think that sometimes maybe we might want the easy answer on worship. I might want to just confirm that the way I'm familiar with is right, and I can just worship on the mountain my fathers worshipped on, so to speak, without having to think too carefully about what it means. And worship traditions run deep, and the Samaritan woman wants to know who's right, us or them, our worship spot or yours, who's true, who's false. And Jesus, after acknowledging the role of the Jews and the God that they know, says true worshipers will worship in spirit and truth. So what is true? And I like the J.B. Phillips translation that translates it reality, worshiping in spirit and reality. So to put it another way, what is real worship in spirit and reality? In John 14, Jesus is the truth. Jesus is the way, the reality, and the life, right? In John 17:17, thy word is truth. And in John's first letter, he talks about not loving people in word and speech, but in deed and in truth. Don't just say, yeah, I hope everything goes well for you, but actually genuinely care about them, actually do something about it. And so being sincere and real about your worship is part of true worship. True worshipers, wherever they approach God, express their genuine reverence for him through Christ, the true way, according with his word through which God reveals himself. So it's not complicated, but it does require us to know God through Christ and his revelation. It's not a rote action or something that we just fall into. We know God, we learn of him and how to approach him in a way that pleases him in his word, and then we thoughtfully, truly worship.
That's a good way to put that. I go to this verse a lot thinking about truth, and I kind of apply that to like all the actions that we do. And that may very well be an accurate way of representing that, worshiping the Lord according to his pattern, according to his plan. But I think there's a deeper message in that, even as you're talking about it, the reality. Worshiping, in a sense, like this is real. This isn't just a performance. This isn't a show or anything. This is an actual real thing that I am doing, and I'm connected to it, and it's genuine.
Yeah, exactly. Spirit and truth, we're talking about coming to him as living spirits who are made alive by God's Spirit and are now coming in authentic, true reverence for him.
Yeah, well, that kind of leads into what I was thinking of here, because you obviously picked off the truth part of it, so I picked off the spirit part of it. Maybe I should have gone first. But I was thinking of it from this spirit aspect, how worship is basically coming from the inside. And that is really the sense that we get from this idea at the end here, where he says God is spirit, and those who worship him must worship in spirit and truth. The whole idea is that God is a spirit. He is spirit. So the fact that he's not human and in the flesh and something that we approach in terms of like a person that we might talk to face, God is a spirit. And so the origins of our worship start in our inside, in the thought processes of our heart and the way that we think and the attitudes that we have. It just kind of reminds you of going back to the previous chapter here in John 3, that Nicodemus, he got really wrapped around the axle when Jesus was talking to him about being born again. Not being born again of a fleshly nature, obviously that's impossible, and that's what he was thinking about. But Jesus was encouraging him to think deeper, being born of the Spirit. This is different. This is not the fleshly kind of activity. When we think about worship, it's a very visible evidence of what we're doing or what we're thinking on the inside. And there has always been a challenge with God's people to not just go through the motions, but to do it as a genuine response from what's going on inside. And I think that's really the focus here that Jesus is focusing on. It's not about this mountain over here. The place doesn't matter. Like if you strip everything back to the core fundamental, what they did in the first century kinds of activities, it wasn't even the activities that were the important part. It was the attitude that led them to do those activities. It was the heart behind why they even sang in the first place, the heart behind why they prayed in the first place, the heart. And it's not even about the things themselves, but why were they doing those things? Well, it came from the Spirit.
Yeah, and I appreciate the word you used, a response. Worship is a response to God. It's a response to his grace. We can't see a spirit, and we don't know who God is except as he reveals himself. And then as he does, we see all of the richness of blessing and the gracious gifts that he's given, all the mercy that he's provided to allow us to come before him. And the more we see of God, the more we want to respond in worship.
All right, so let's get into our second segment here on the episode, and that is heavy words.
Whoa, this is heavy. There's that word again, heavy. Why are things so heavy in the future? Is there a problem with the Earth's gravitational pull?
So as we get into thinking about worship here, there's a couple words used throughout the New Testament that I think would be helpful for us to define and talk about in a little bit more detail. The word worship really gets thrown around a lot and probably used in some maybe inappropriate ways. Maybe people have a misunderstanding about worship. So let's define some terms.
Yeah, this word proskuneo is a word in our New Testament in Greek that's translated worship. It goes back to the beginning of the New Testament in Matthew 2, where the wise men are coming and they bow down and worship Jesus. They bow down before him. So it relates literally or figuratively to bowing down. So one reference work describes it as the custom of prostrating oneself before persons and kissing their feet or the hem of their garment or the ground, as this expression of lowering yourself, of your complete dependence or submission to a high authority, to fall down and worship, to do obeisance to prostrate oneself before, to do reverence to or welcome respectively. And so I think this word helps us to see that worship expresses not just our praise, but our submission and our dependence and our obedience, our surrender, as well as our deepest adoration. This is the word that's used in John 4, that passage we just talked about throughout that for worship, and it's often used in the New Testament to describe worshiping God. It's interesting to me that the only instance of this in the worship assembly that I've found is describing someone who's an outsider coming in and learning of God and worshiping. And I think that's interesting because often we use worship as a shorthand for the assembly. Like I might say, I'm going to worship, or after worship today, or on Sunday at worship, like that's the shorthand for our assembly or our gathering together on the first day of the week or some other time to edify one another and indeed to worship God. That's appropriate that we do worship God there, but worship happens in so many other places, as John 4 implies, and times. It can happen individually. It can happen all over the place. And this picture in 1 Corinthians 14 in the assembly, I think is helpful to understanding the depth and meaning and that submission idea of worship, where he's talking to the Corinthians about making sure that whenever they're in their assemblies, that what they say can be understood. If they're speaking in a foreign tongue through a miraculous gift of tongues, then they need to have a translator. And he says, if the whole church comes together and all speak in tongues and outsiders or unbelievers enter, won't they say you're out of your minds? Verse 23 of 1 Corinthians 14. But if all prophesy, all speak the words from God that can be understood, and an unbeliever or outsider enters, he is convicted by all. He is called to account by all. The secrets of his heart are disclosed, and so, falling on his face, he will worship God, proskuneo God, and declare that God is really among you. So this worship is this absolute breaking open of someone through the word of God, as we all have been opened up and made bare before God as he has pierced our hearts and convicted us, and we have come to realize who we are, who God is, the change we need to bring, and the grace that God has revealed. And what can we do but fall on our face and worship God and declare God is really among his church, his people. So that's in the assembly that little picture, that little imaginary scenario is drawn out. And certainly, if you think about all the different things we do in our assembly, there are things we do to serve one another, but ultimately all of it is lifting up God. And speaking of serving, that leads us perhaps to the next New Testament word that's used and often translated worship.
And that is latreo. And usually this word is, like you talked about, geared towards service. It's also translated as duties, which I know is one of your favorite words, service, and worship. So basically this word has a lot to do with like what the priests would do in offering their service. Mm-hmm. And we are very far removed from the time of the priests, so it may not be entirely obvious to us what a priest actually does in their functions, but you don't have to look for very long in the Old Testament to find out what the priests were up to. The Levitical system of the priesthood was all about going through these acts of service, these acts of worship, to help the people really do the kinds of things that the Lord God had called them to do in offering their sacrifices and making atonement for their sins. Really, that is what our worship is about in a lot of cases in terms of these outward activities or these outward actions. Like Paul talks about in Romans 12, verse 1, we daily offer ourselves as a living sacrifice. That is our spiritual worship. So this is not just talking about our activities that we do in public worship, but it does include the things that we do privately. These are our sacrifices. These are our acts of worship. And so we offer to God from our finances. We offer to God from our time and attention. We present to Him a fragrant offering, a sacrifice that's acceptable and pleasing to Him. That happens in our songs and in our prayers and in all the things that we do. We are like priests, thinking about our job as servants of the Lord. And it just kind of got me thinking about how there was a lot of trouble in the Old Testament, near the end especially, with the Lord's people, especially the priests, and the way that they were presenting that offering. Malachi is a great example, but I was recently reading Isaiah at the end when the people would come back from Babylonian captivity. And in Isaiah 66, verse 3, God says, "He who slaughters an ox is like one who kills a man. He who sacrifices a lamb like one who breaks a dog's neck. He who presents a grain offering like one who offers pig's blood. He who makes a memorial offering of frankincense like one who blesses an idol. These have chosen their own ways, and their soul delights in their abominations." It's like these amazing sacrifices that God had called them to make, and all the things that He wanted them to do. He was just so tired of seeing those sacrifices being made now by a people who just didn't care and didn't love God and weren't doing these things in sincerity. They were completely just going through the motions. And eventually God got so tired of it, He just wanted somebody to shut the doors. And as priests, that's just something we always need to remember. Like, make the connection. Make that serious connection and reverently consider, like Solomon talks about in Ecclesiastes 5, whenever we go to the house of the Lord, we need to be very careful. As he says in verse 2, "Be not rash with your mouth, nor let your heart be hasty to utter a word before God. For God is in heaven, and you are on earth. Therefore let your words be few." Just be very careful when you come before the Lord in your worship. It's a time of reverence and a time that we need to be very thoughtful about our motives. So
yes,
let's continue that into our next segment here, our final segment, which is Through the Week.
I am ready to face any challenges that might be foolish enough to face me.
So every week we drop 5 challenges that we're going to do, and we encourage you to do them along with us. And so our first challenge is a reading challenge. And what are we going to read together this week?
We will read John 4:20-24, which we just talked about, Colossians 3:14-17, Romans 12:1-2, Psalm 95, 1-6, and Malachi 1, 6-14. And looking at that last passage, I was thinking of a tale of two gifts.
Okay.
So on Sunday, my son Asher brought me one of my favorite candies, which is Twizzlers. I don't know if you know this, but there's a debate about Red Vines versus Twizzlers.
I'm a Red Vines guy. I'm sorry. We can't do this podcast anymore.
Red Vines are trash. Forget you. I'm not talking to you. The podcast is broken. Twizzlers are the correct answer. So anyways, Asher knows this answer, and he knows this about me, that I love Twizzlers. And so he kept reminding me all day. He brought me these Twizzlers and kept saying, "Dad, don't forget your Twizzlers. You left them on the seat." And he really wanted me to enjoy this because he knows this is something I love. And it's not the first time that they've won a prize in class to pick any candy or toy that they wanted, and they instead chose my favorite to bring to me. And that's a gift, right? Of love and honor. That means something. It's very different than when on one of the 3 candy holidays in our house, whenever they have their stash from their stocking or their basket or whatever, I might ask for a piece of candy and they offer one of the gross things that they would never eat. I guess you can have that big orange peanut.
Circus peanuts? I love those.
Yeah. Oh, they're the worst.
Oh,
man,
so good.
You have the worst taste in candy I've ever heard.
So.
Well, what do you think is the worst candy?
Black licorice.
Oh, I can handle black licorice. I used to hate it.
Yeah.
But like Tootsie Rolls, you get a million Tootsie Rolls. They don't do anything for me. So, they might say, yeah, you can have one of those. I've got a billion of them. I don't really like them anyway. And so what a big difference. The gift in either way, it's not a big deal. I can buy a bag full of Twizzlers or whatever kind of candy. This is just a tiny piece of candy. But the spirit of the gift makes a difference.
Right.
And so this passage in Malachi 1, 6-14 is about the spirit of the gift and the kind of gift that's given. God says, if I'm a father, where is my honor? You should honor your fathers. If I'm a master, where is my fear? You should fear your master. And he says, you're bringing me blind sheep. You're bringing me broken down, lame, handicapped sheep. And these are things that you don't want. And so you just say, okay, well, might as well just give that to God. Who else wants it? He says specifically, you would never offer this to your governor. But because you can't see God or you don't really care what this gift expresses to him, you give him your leftover junk. You give him your orange peanut candy or your black licorice or your Tootsie Rolls. So to me, this is an important distinction because we can feel like maybe we have to find a way to give God the worthy gift. And the fact is, we will never find a gift fully worthy of God. We'll never be worthy of God. But just like a father values that macaroni art Father's Day card that the toddler slaves over in love. Like, I have no idea what this is. Maybe there's a face in there. I don't know what that is. Daddy, do you like it? Yes, I love it. I'm going to treasure it, at least for a week until I sneak it into the trash later. But it means something to me for now. But God values our gifts when we consider what he wants and we seek to express reverent worship to him. We're trying to say something to him. We're willing to make a sacrifice. We're willing to give up what could be ours to give to him. And we give up our preferences to honor his preferences. And our heart is really seeking to adore him and express something to him. And God values that.
It sounds like it's the thought that counts.
Yeah. I mean, that sounds almost like, wah, wah. Well, that was a stinky gift, but it's the thought that counts. But yeah, that is what I'm trying to say, is that if your intention is to serve God and you're, as we talked about, in spirit and in truth, and you're trying to understand how God wants you to give, then the way you do it matters. He didn't want, no matter how sincere you might think you were, I mean, they were literally offering blind sheep. So the act mattered, but the act was expressing the thought, right? Expressing that they didn't really care. So yeah, the thought that counts.
Yeah. And you're not going to give God the leftovers if the thought is he is to be revered.
Right, exactly.
All right, so let's get into our second challenge here, and that's a reflect challenge. And this week we're going to ask ourselves, what distracts me from my true focus in worship? I don't know how this landed on me, but obviously the most distractible person is going to get to answer this question. So
I don't know, man. I'll arm wrestle you for that one.
Yeah, for sure. So I started thinking about empty mental and spiritual calories. So thinking about how we are nourished by our worship and how that's such an important part of what we do and our activities every day. And thinking about what we do when we get together with the church and how fulfilling that is to be together and to worship together. What distracts me from my focus in those moments, though, is often those sugary, sweet, unfulfilling, empty calories. Rather than, for example, like a protein-packed prayer to my God to start out the morning. What about a sugary, sweet morning news binge as I sit there on the couch? It's like, I could do one or the other. Oftentimes, though, or too often, I will choose the thing that isn't fulfilling. And I'll spend my time doing that rather than like a soul-nourishing, heartfelt song to my God, singing in harmony with people that I love, my brothers and sisters, on a Sunday morning. Rather than doing that, maybe I'm just focused on that carbo-loaded smartphone in my pocket. These are just things that we can all distract ourselves with. And thinking about what we would be distracted by in worship is one thing, but thinking about what distracts me from worship every single day, I think, is maybe even a more relevant way to think about that. What are the benefits of these distractions? They're not going to be meaningful in the long term. They're not going to change my life for the better. If anything, they're just going to be short, fleeting little moments of self-gratification, and then they're going to go away, and I'll just be looking for the next thing.
That makes me think of my favorite psalm, Psalm 63, where he talks about praising God and lifting his hands up towards his name, blessing him. And he says, my soul will be satisfied with rich food. I'm going to be satisfied by praising and worshiping God. I am not so much going to be satisfied after some of those eating black licorice for breakfast in the morning.
Yeah, it's a good way to think about it.
Yeah. Okay, so our next challenge is a request challenge. Heavenly Father, may your name be held in reverence. And this comes from Matthew 6:9 in Jesus' model prayer at the center of the Sermon on the Mount, where he says in King James English, hallowed be thy name. This is a forgotten first prayer, I think. I used to think it was a statement of praise, but it's really a request. It's a deep desire and a prayer that in my life and in all the world, God would not be dishonored, but would receive the honor that his name deserves. And consistently praying for God to be honored, for his name to be held as holy, changes my tone in talking about and even thinking about God. Like we've been saying, there's no room for casual conversation about the Holy One. It's worshipful submission and honor, or it's nothing. So this request opens Jesus' model prayer. Our Father in heaven, hallowed be your name. And I think it's a good place for our prayers to start. Seeking for God to be honored helps me to remember who I'm speaking to, helps me to have the right tone in the rest of the prayer, and it changes the way I request things and what I say and what I give thanks for, and I think sets the tone not just for that prayer, but for our whole life. Because if we don't start with adoring worship, it's harder to settle into that profound act that, as you said, not one-dimensional, but fully realized act of approaching the throne of God and remembering who we come to address.
Yeah, that's really good. All right, so our next challenge here is a respond challenge, and that's us taking action this week by doing something. This week, we're going to bow down in our room and pray a psalm of worship. Our family over the last few months has been doing these chalkboard proverbs. So every week we choose a proverb or an excerpt from the Psalms and we write it on a chalkboard in our living room. It's a very Pinterest thing to do, and that's what we're up to. But I think it's helpful for us to think about these words as a family collectively. Yeah. But this challenge is really a more personal, private challenge between you and God, and using the Psalms as a template for worship. They're full of praise songs in those Psalms. And so if you're looking for something to use as a model as you pray to the Lord through these Psalms, maybe Psalm 42 is a good one. As the deer pants for flowing streams, so pants my soul for you, O God. Again, hard not to sing that, but pray through these Psalms in a way that really expresses your worship and respect to God. And I almost think, in a sense, it's like tracing letters. You know, if you are just learning how to draw or just learning how to write, as you're tracing something and learning how someone who's proficient in this operates. This is kind of like what we do in reading through and praying through the Psalms. We are praying through a Holy Spirit breathed writer who we can follow along in our praise to God with similar words and thoughts.
Yeah, that's really good. Yeah, like God is guiding our hand to help us know how to speak to him. That's really helpful. And our last challenge is a reach out challenge, as we call it, a challenge to ask someone a spiritual question and start a good conversation. And that's what we want to do right now. So I'm going to ask Brian this question. What idols have you dethroned from your heart to keep God at the center?
That's a good question. For me, I think one of those is being right. I have this natural tendency to want to be right, or to want to have done something right, or to want to look back at a situation in my life and feel like I said all the right things, I did everything correctly. There's no reason for anyone to say anything bad about what I did. It's that perfectionist mindset that I have. You might think that that should be my focus, right? That maybe a Christian should be trying to do everything right. Sure, I understand that. I believe that I'm striving and pushing forward with this growth mentality to do things more correctly every day. But the act of being right, I think for me, has stood up as a problem, and it's just bolstered my pride too oftentimes. It's closed my ears when somebody does have a correction to give me, and I think that I'm right, then I choose not to listen. And if I could really just strip that away, I think this is something that I've been working on much more now than I had been as a younger man, but really just trying to recognize that I don't have all the answers. I don't have everything figured out. And until I realize that, then I'm really not able to grow, and I'm not able to move forward and take new ground. And again, I was reading through Isaiah, so the verse right before one of those verses I read earlier in Isaiah 66, verse 2 says, "This is the one to whom I will look, he who is humble and contrite in spirit and trembles at my words." I think that's what I'm just working on, is just being the kind of person who doesn't have to be standing up pridefully saying, I have all the answers. I don't have all the answers, but I know who does. It's the God in whom I fear. And just reminding myself of that a lot is a way to put God back at the center and keep my correct, pompous self out of the middle of it all.
Yeah, that pride that makes us feel like our identity needs to be the person who is right is actually a barrier to being right, because we don't allow ourselves then to learn and to be corrected and to humbly know that we are fallible. I think that's a human idol that is easy to construct for all of us.
For sure. So for you, what idols have you dethroned from your heart to keep God at the center?
Lately, it's been control. I've been learning the last few months that as much as I want to control things and make everyone around me okay and make the church and the world everything I want it to be, I am, wait for it, not God.
Shocker.
And I can't construct a future of my own choosing. I can't save everyone. And the more I grasp to hold on tight to what I feel needs to happen, it's very similar to what you said, like grasping on tight to I'm right. And similarly, grasping on to this is how it has to go, and I'm gonna steer everyone and everything that way. Or on the other hand, fighting against what I'm afraid might happen. It just weakens my prayers, and it just weakens the influence that I do have to accomplish good in all these areas. God can do great things, and he is at work in me, and he is at work in my prayers, and he is at work in the gospel and in his spirit and in the world. He is doing his work. And so I do have agency, and I do have influence, and I can call on him and partner with him, but I have to also have this willingness to let go of what I think and what I am fighting for, and to live and rest in the will of God and in what happens. And I'm walking by faith, trusting that he can work through it, work it to a good end, work something meaningful out of what might otherwise look like the whole thing is veering out of control and not going the way I want.
It's hard not to think about Joseph while you're talking about that.
Yeah.
Just all the things that he went through and the lack of control he had over almost anything. I mean, come on. You would be in all these situations that he was in, and everything worked out the way God meant it to work out, and he just went through it and trusted the Lord and understood that this was not him driving the ship and being in the bottom of a pit and being in jail and being in all these situations. Who knows if it was ever going to work out, but he was just trusting the Lord. And that's a good way for us all to live, really, seeing his control and just being that part of the plan as he drives the ship.
Yeah, Joseph couldn't possibly have had any idea
No.
really how all of that was going to play out when he's
Nope.
sitting in prison again, like still waiting for that guy to remember and all of these things that kept happening. But looking back, you can see the way God has folded things together. And the irony of all of this is the more I let go of that other way of thinking and control and fear and those kinds of things, the more I see my prayers being effective, the more I am learning to pray within the will of God and see his might and his goodness just acting. And it just seems like every prayer is like, wow, I did not expect you to answer it that way, but you have done something great over and over again. And it's just really exciting to just see as we worship and call on the living God what he can do.
All right, so what are we talking about next week?
Well, next week we're going to focus on a final area of reverence, which is holy living. How does our reverence for God, our godliness, change how we make choices and live amongst a world that's full of darkness? How do we align ourselves with the holiness and goodness of God?
I'm sure there will be a little bit of This Little Light of Mine in that episode, so get your songbooks out. Thanks, everyone, for tuning into the Bible Geeks podcast. You can find us on our website at BibleGeeks.fm. You can find show notes for this episode in your podcast player of choice or at BibleGeeks.fm/111. You can also follow along with this cross-training series on our website as well. And if you want to jump into our Facebook group, we'd love to have you on board talking about these through the week challenges. And until next week, everyone, may the Lord bless you and keep you.
Shalom.